Welcome everybody to our EPEL lecture. Thank you to AKSE for the financing of our EPEL lecture. And today we have Tongfi Kim. Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Brücker.
Yeah, we are also, of course, very delighted to have Tongfi Kim here for the inaugural guest lecture in the seminar. Just a few short words of introduction, perhaps. Tongfi Kim is an assistant professor at Vesalius College in the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Brussels School in Brussels, Belgium. He is also the program director of international affairs and a senior researcher at the KF-VUB Korea chair. Dr. Kim previously worked as an associate fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt and obtained a PhD in 2010 from Ohio State University after undergraduate and graduate studies in Japan. His research area is international security, international relations of East Asia, and military alliances, which, among others, he has written about in his book, The Supply Side of Security, A Market Theory of Military Alliances, published with Stanford University Press. In addition, he has published several articles in renowned journals, including, for example, Arms, Alliances, and Patron-Client Relationships, published in International Security in 2018, as well as more recently, he was the co-author of a 2020 KF-VUB Korea Chair report with the title, Beyond Traditional Security, South Korea's Positioning Towards the Cyber, Energy, Maritime, and Trade Security Domains. With that being said, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Kim, and we are again very happy to have him here and excited to hear what he has to say.
Thank you for the nice introduction. And before I start, can everyone hear me clear and well? Okay, good. Thank you. As introduced, I'm an assistant professor and also a senior researcher at the Korea chair in Brussels. We recently had this alliance between Vesalius College and Institute for European Studies, and now we are both housed at the Brussels School of Governance. I'm really happy to talk with German students because Germany is a special country for me. My wife is German, my daughters are German citizens, so I have a very strong attachment to Germany. And I don't know if you covered this topic in this course, but I'm a Korean born and raised in Japan. And my grandparents moved to Japan from Korea during the colonial period. My research focuses on international security of East Asia, especially on military alliances. I will try to cover the basic history of the US-South Korea alliance in today's lecture, but later during the questions and answers, I hope we can discuss the current issues and the future of the alliance, especially in relation to the People's Republic of China. Let me start with an anecdote I saw a while ago on social media. I didn't observe it myself, and this is a paraphrasing of what a South Korean academic wrote. But I think this half joke is really fitting for our lecture today. The background context is that this is a conversation between two young Korean men as the inter-Korean relations were improving with South Korean President Moon Jae-in's engagement policy for peace with North Korea. According to what I read, one young man said that they should try to postpone going to the military service because they will not have to do it once the two Koreas peacefully reunite. But then the other man says that they have to hurry going to the military because after reunification, they could be assigned to the current border between North Korea and China. I suspect that this exchange is supposed to be a joke, but it also reveals the geopolitical realities that South Korea faces. And we might also be able to make up a counterpart joke for Chinese soldiers. As frustrating as North Korea is as an ally to China, a unified Korea with the alliance with the United States can be quite threatening from the Chinese perspective. Due to their geographical contiguity, the historical ties between China and Korea are old and deep. States on the Korean Peninsula have suffered many invasions by dynasties based in China. On other occasions, for example, during the two Japanese invasions of Korea around the end of the 16th century, China acted as the protector of Korea. By the time of the Three Kingdoms of Korea, which was 1st through 7th centuries, the Korean Peninsula was at least informally part of the China-centered tributary system, and it remained under the system until after the defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War. The South Korean public's perception of China is changing to a negative direction, but it has traditionally been quite good, especially compared to the South Korean perception of Japan. This is interesting considering that many of the more than 900 foreign invasions Korea suffered came from China or dynasties established by tribes in its northern region. And as a side note to the importance of China in Korean history, the concept of juche and criticism of Sade originally developed against China in the early 20th century, even though these concepts are now predominantly discussed in the context of North Korean ideologies. The most recent military conflict that directly involved China and Korea was the Korean War that began in June 1950. In January 1950, US Secretary of State Dean Acheson, in his speech at the National Press Club, left Korea and Taiwan outside a US defensive perimeter. Combined with the withdrawal of the US troops from the Korean Peninsula in 1949, it seemed to North Koreans that their invasion of the South would not be resisted by American force. Once the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, however, the United States changed its policy and fought a very costly war for the next 3 years. China intervened as the United States counterattack against North Korea succeeded, and the United States did not take the Chinese warning of intervention seriously. China sent nominally volunteer armies to avoid the official war with the United States, but the Chinese soldiers were obviously ordered to go to Korea, and some Chinese soldiers apparently didn't even know that they were being sent to Korea. So much for being volunteer army. As many as 3 million Chinese civilian and military personnel might have served in Korea during the war. Over 53,000 Americans, hundreds of thousands of Korean and Chinese soldiers, and millions of civilians died, but the border remained substantially where it had been in June 1950. The war strengthened the relationship between China and North Korea, and in 1961, they signed a military alliance, which still exists. Alliances are typically understood as tools for fighting war or intimidate other states, but academic research on alliances has shown that military alliances also play an important role in restraining alliance members from taking risky or offensive actions. In fact, the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and South Korea was signed initially more for the purpose of restraining South Korea than for the purpose of deterring North Korea. South Korean President Lee Sung-man was sabotaging the negotiations for the armistice, and Dwight Eisenhower accepted his demand for a mutual defense treaty in exchange for the South Korean president's cooperation to stop the Korean War. So ironically, the United States ended up fighting the Korean War because it left out South Korea from its defense commitment initially. And then the United States ended up signing an alliance with South Korea because it wanted to stop the war. At the end of the Korean War in 1953, there were more than 320,000 American soldiers in Korea. But by April 2008, the number had been reduced to 28,500, and the troop level remains around the same until now, even though we actually don't know the specific deployment arrangement because the Department of Defense has been not so transparent about it. And this figure on the screen shows that the troop level has a downward trend with some fluctuations. In addition to the number of troops, the United States also reduced its commitment by relocating its troops away from the demilitarized zone in the early 1970s and the early 2000s. The Sino-US rapprochement in the early 1970s with Kissinger and Nixon visiting China. That was a shock to the South Korean government, and Seoul began to seek ways to improve its relationship with Beijing. But Tongfi, South Korean president, the dictator, but Tongfi had already been concerned about the declining US military commitment in Asia since US President Richard Nixon announced his Guam Doctrine in July 1969. The United States seemed to be disengaging from South Vietnam, and in early 1971, 20,000 of the 62,000 American troops stationed in South Korea were withdrawn. Park Chung-hee reportedly called these US policies, quote, a message to the Korean people that we won't rescue you if North Korea invades again, end of quote. Consequently, Park Chung-hee initiated policies to improve Seoul's relationships with socialist states. In 1972, for example, the South Korean government legalized trade with communist states, except for North Korea and Cuba. In his special speech on foreign policy on June 23, 1973, Park declared that South Korea would open its door to all states, regardless of their ideologies. The two countries began indirect trade, China and South Korea. They began indirect trade in the late 1970s, and the informal economic cooperation between China and South Korea steadily expanded as both countries' economies rapidly grew. In the late 1980s, anti-Americanism became active along with the liberalization of the political process in South Korea. And South Korean domestic opposition gained political significance for the first time in the history of the alliance. In the early 1980s, resentment of the United States increased among the South Korean public, most importantly because they identify the United States with the military junta of their country. The assassination of President Park Chung-hee in 1979 raised the hope of democratization after 18 years of Park's dictatorship. But military officers led by Chun Doo-han quickly took power through a coup d'etat within the military. Protests against the military takeover were severely suppressed, and hundreds were killed in the city of Gwangju. Although the US government did not support Chun Doo-han's actions and merely faced a fait accompli, the South Korean public held it responsible for the coup d'etat and the Gwangju massacre. At the time of the coup d'etat, the US government still had the operational control of the two countries' militaries in Korea. And the US failure to stop Chun was considered to be an intentional act. Moreover, President Ronald Reagan took a friendly approach to Chonduhan, giving him a warm White House reception and legitimating his rule. Because of this, criticism of the United States became radical among student groups in South Korea, and some of them even set fire to the US Cultural Center in Gwangju in December 1980, and to the US Cultural Center in Busan in 1982. As the democratization movement gathered broader and broader support among the public, anti-Americanism also became less of a taboo. After the transition to a democratically elected government in 1987, the liberalized political environment further opened up the possibility for opposition against the US-South Korea alliance. South Korea's real gross national product expanded a lot by an average of more than 8% per year from US $2.3 billion in 1962 to about $204 billion in 1989. And per capita annual income, of course, also grew exponentially from below $100 in 1962 to almost $5,000 in 1989. Reflecting this rising economic power, South Korea in the 1980s developed Nordpolitik. I guess German students are probably familiar with Ostpolitik of West Germany toward East Germany. And the name is a little bit misleading because in the case of Nordpolitik, South Korea didn't directly engage North Korea, and rather South Korea was trying to engage North Korea's allies and try to isolate Pyongyang. And in this process, South Korea improved its relations with the Soviet Union and China, especially through economic engagement. Even after the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries moved toward political, diplomatic ties with South Korea after the 1988 Seoul Olympics, China was still cautious and insisted on separation of politics from economics. But South Korean President Roh Tae-woo kept pushing for diplomatic normalization with Beijing. Beijing was sensitive to Pyongyang's concerns, but Beijing eventually established diplomatic relations with Seoul in August 1992. As Chinese officials confided to a Japanese diplomat, China used flattering and saving face to obtain North Korea's acceptance of the change. With its growing economic power, China continues to support North Korea economically, and North Korea's increased dependence on China has made Beijing more important in South Korea's foreign policy. By the way, for the diplomatic normalization, China demanded South Korea to break off its diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And Taiwan even threatened to open official relations and expand trade with North Korea, but South Korea complied with Beijing's demands. All these interesting anecdotes are recorded in Don Overdorfer's really well-known book, Two Koreans, for those of you who are interested in these episodes. As a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, China became the sole protector of North Korea. And this shift, as well as the end of the Cold War, transformed the alliance between Beijing and Pyongyang. While the Cold War continued and while the Sino-Soviet relations were really hostile, North Korea could get support from both Beijing and Moscow by letting them compete for the loyalty of North Korea. But that option no longer existed after the end of the Cold War. China's 1961 defense pact with North Korea is supposed to involve Beijing automatically when North Korea is attacked. But Beijing became increasingly ambivalent about its defense obligation. Chinese public opinion also became increasingly critical of North Korea, and the Chinese government has been allowing state-run media and policy experts to criticize North Korea. Pyongyang's dependence on Beijing for political and military support is still great, but the bilateral relationships between the two neighbors are weaker and more contentious than during the Cold War. Although the Chinese political system is still distant from democracy, North Korea's dynastic political system and isolationist economic policy are alien to the current Chinese leadership. The ideological and strategic forces of the Cold War are long gone, and so are the personal ties between the older generations who fought together against the Japanese Empire or the United States. Geography still makes North Korea an important strategic partner for China, but the partner is anything but easy to deal with. Given the economic troubles and provocative behavior of Pyongyang, North Korea is more a source of trouble than an asset for China. But most recently, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, became more valuable to Beijing because of the intensifying geopolitical competition between Beijing and Washington. So the relationship between China and North Korea have been improving in the last few years. Starting with the 1993-1994 nuclear crisis between the United States and North Korea, South Korea has had to worry about the possibility of a second Korean War, initiated not by North Korea, but by the United States for the purpose of nuclear non-proliferation or a preventive war. Before then, the alliance dynamic had been mostly about South Korea worrying about abandonment by the United States, and the United States worrying about being entrapped or entangled in a war for South Korea. In a situation where the United States is no longer necessarily committed to the status quo of the Korean Peninsula and wants to reverse the nuclear weapons development of North Korea, South Korea has to worry about the risk of war initiated by the United States. When we think about South Korean government's policy toward the US-ROK alliance, especially those of progressive presidents like Roh Moo-hyun and Moon Jae-in, they try to please the United States not just to avoid abandonment, but they also make concessions to the United States so that they have more leverage, more voice in US policy towards North Korea and avoid South Korea's entanglement in a US war against North Korea. By the way, even in recent years, it is not just South Korea restraining the United States from taking a risky action. For example, former US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates wrote in his memoir that President Lee Myung-bak initially wanted to retaliate against North Korea's shelling of Yongbyon Island in 2010 in a disproportionately aggressive manner. So the restraining works both ways. In that sense, I would say that the US-ROK alliance can continue to serve as an institutional mechanism where the United States and South Korea can restrain each other from taking a risky or offensive action. The role of China as North Korea's patron has changed in a few important ways since the early 1990s. And China is now an important partner for South Korea in many issues regarding North Korea. South Korea's threat perception of North Korea has changed significantly as North Korea's relative capability declined in the 1990s and as the cost of unification loomed large. And by the way, in this process, South Korea learned a lot from Germany's reunification. So Koreans were obviously very excited when they saw the two Germanys to be reunited. But then they saw how costly it is to have such a reunification. And they also knew that unlike East Germany, which was relatively wealthy and also relatively small, absorbing North Korea would be very costly for South Korea. So neither South Korea nor China wants a destabilized North Korea as its neighbor. South Korea and China also share interests in the denuclearization of North Korea, although non-proliferation is not as important to them as it is to the United States. Significantly, cooperation with China is important for South Korea's policy toward Pyongyang, regardless of the South Korean government's preferred policy, because China is important for both sanctions and positive engagement. It's natural for South Korea and other actors to expect Beijing to have significant influence over Pyongyang, because North Korea relies on China for more than 70% of its trade and 80% of its foreign capital and much of its oil imports. And probably the number is actually much higher. North Korea's economic dependence on China increased dramatically since the early 1990s. The share of China in North Korea's total trade increased particularly fast in the 2000s. Whereas North Korea's trade dependence on the Soviet Union was 56% in 1990, North Korea's trade dependence on China reached 83% in 2010. China's economic support helps reduce the risk of destabilization in North Korea, but it also reduces the effectiveness of the economic pressure that the international society can impose on China. In addition, although China's security tie with North Korea has many problems, it still has some deterrence effects against attacks on North Korea. South Korea is an export-oriented economy, and it's very much integrated in the global economy. So it is subsequently vulnerable to external influences, especially its main trading partners. And China is the largest trading partner of South Korea. About a quarter of South Korea's export goes to China. And usually the second and the third combined still are far from China's share. So in terms of economic dependence, South Korea is really dependent on China more than on any other country. As South Korea's economic growth heavily relies on exports, any government in Seoul has a stake in a good relationship with Beijing. South Korea's asymmetric dependence on the Chinese market creates a bargaining leverage for China. For instance, when South Korea restricted the import of garlic from China in 2000 because of the domestic agricultural lobby, China aggressively retaliated by restricting the import of mobile phones and polyester from South Korea. South Korea was forced to surrender quickly, and the trade dispute soured the relationship between the two countries. South Korea's trade dependence on China is considered to be a very serious risk that needs to be managed by the South Korean government. And the next slide shows another example of how South Korea's economic dependence on China can be used against it by China, this time in the context of the US-ROK alliance. You have probably come across this term, terminal high altitude area defense, in the process of this course. And on this topic, I recommend my Korea chair colleague, Maximilian Ernst's recent article from the Korea Economic Institute of America. And let me quote some passages from his article. Beijing was threatened by Seoul's 2016 decision to let the United States Forces Korea deploy a third battery to Korea. Beijing alleged that the third radar allows the United States to detect Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles early, as well as to identify decoys, improving the US capability to intercept Chinese ICBMs and undermining China's nuclear deterrent. Once deployment had been decided in July 2016, Beijing escalated from mere diplomatic opposition. First, reports of economic retaliation appeared in August, notably from the entertainment and travel industries. The brunt of this retaliation lasted about 14 months until October 2017, 2 months after THAAD was fully deployed. China's economic retaliation can be summarized into 3 dimensions. 1, particularly grave sanctions against the conglomerate Lotte. 2, strong sanctions against South Korea's travel and entertainment industry. And 3, sporadic incitement of boycotts and bureaucratic scrutiny of Korean enterprises, without proven but likely involvement of the Chinese government. Lotte was singled out because it had agreed to provide a golf course in Sonju as a launching site for THAAD. The primary tools of coercion used against Lotte were extraordinary tax investigations and sanitation checks against its business operations in China. To make sure that the connection between these measures and THAAD was understood, Chinese state media announced that Lotte should reject the land swap deal with the Korean government or face consequences. China's repressions resulted in a loss of almost 77% of Lotte Mart's sales in China in 2017 and subsequent withdrawal from the Chinese market altogether. Another potentially important dispute between South Korea and China is one on their maritime boundaries. China and South Korea have a maritime boundary dispute, and illegal fishing by Chinese ships has been a contentious issue, which has resulted in the deaths of Chinese fishermen and South Korean Coast Guard personnel. Both China and South Korea are parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they both claim 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone from their baselines, but their claims overlap because the Yellow Sea is less than 400 nautical miles wide. Whereas Seoul prefers to use the equidistance line as the basis for their maritime boundary, Beijing argues that its longer coastline and larger population should be considered. South Korea and China also have a dispute over what Koreans call Iodo, and in China known as Suyanjiao, a submerged rock that the two countries consider to belong to their own exclusive economic zone. Although Iodo, as an underwater reef, does not have a territorial status in international law, and the two governments actually agree that they do not have a territorial dispute, this issue has created tensions between the two states, especially after South Korea began constructing the Iodo Ocean Research Station, which was completed in 2003. Illegal fishing by Chinese ships in the South Korean EEZ complicates the relations further. South Korea's Fisheries Association estimates that the economic loss for the country from Chinese illegal fishing is 1.3 trillion won per year. South Korea's Coast Guard captured 248 Chinese ships in 2016, 160 in 2017, 136 in 2018, and 115 in 2019 for illegal fishing. So the number is declining, but there's still a lot of potential for creating a political crisis, especially if these illegal fishing leads to violence between the Korean Coast Guard and Chinese fishermen. And of course, China's growing military capability worries South Korea as well. Japan and the United States are known to be worried about increasing power of China. And South Korea tends to focus more on the direct threat from the immediate neighbor to the north. But China is very close to South Korea as well. And South Koreans indeed worry about the growing military might of China. And when you look at this graph, I don't know if I made it last minute, so this may not be so easy to see, but can you all see the lines on the graph? So the green line is that of South Korea, and it's actually increasing quite substantially. But when you compare it with China, it's nothing comparable, right? And yes, the US military expenditure is still very high and much higher than that of China's. But the important thing to note is that the United States is a global power, and not all of this military resource of the United States is available for the protection of its East Asian allies. So both Japanese and South Korean policymakers are worried about the local balance of local military balance between the China and the United States and its allies. Maritime security issues farther away from the Korean Peninsula have also become increasingly important to solve because of China's disputes with other countries. China's maritime territorial disputes are of grave concern to South Korea, although South Korea does not have its own territorial dispute with China. According to a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2013, 83% of South Korean respondents said that they were concerned that territorial disputes between China and its neighbors could lead to a military conflict. China has a dispute with Japan over what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and what the Chinese call Diaoyu Islands. And the United States has a defense obligation over the Japanese-administered Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. China also has conflicting claims with the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan in the South China Sea. And US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared on the 1st of March 2019 that, quote, any armed attack on Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea will trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4 of the US-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, end of quote. A military conflict in the East China Sea or the South China Sea can create a large disruption for the global economy. And South Korea's mutual defense treaty with the United States and export dependence on China make the maintenance of peace particularly important for Seoul. Now, we are coming to a more colorful contemporary period, and you have probably read and discussed a lot about President Trump and Korea's in this course as well. President Trump is known for his anti-alliance stance. And before his election, for example, he suggested countries like Japan and South Korea could get nuclear weapons and defend themselves. In March 2016, Trump said that the United States would not maintain military bases abroad unless allies like Japan and South Korea coughed up more money to retain them. In office, he actually pushed for these changes. Trump initially demanded exponential increase of South Korea's defense cost sharing to as much as $5 billion from the roughly and $0.9 billion. After the 2018 US-DPRK summit in Singapore, Trump abruptly announced to suspend joint military exercises with South Korea, apparently without consulting with the South Korean government. I actually think that the current South Korean government wouldn't have been particularly unhappy about it to the extent that such measures are conducive to reducing the tension between North Korea and the United States. But the manner in which this was conducted, that really worried South Korean policymakers. And after the summit, Trump remarked that he wants to get US soldiers out from South Korea and bring them back home, although he also said that that's not part of the equation at that point. And for your information, under the Biden administration, in March 2021, South Korea and the United States agreed to a 6-year defense cost sharing deal, with South Korea paying about $1 billion, which was still almost 14% increase from the previous year, but nothing comparable to the rather ridiculous more than 5 times increase demanded by President Trump. Now, with Joe Biden in the White House, the US-ROK alliance is in a better atmosphere. And recent polls indicate surprisingly similar views of the South Korean and American publics toward the alliance and China. Let me go through some figures and quote passages from this article by Carl Friedhoff and So-Yeon Park. The polls themselves were conducted in March this year. First, the two countries look at each other favorably. South Koreans give the United States a mean score of 6 out of 10, and Americans give South Korea a mean score of 60 on the 60 out of 100, and higher number being the most favorable score. And more importantly, for the South Korean public, this is not just about defense commitment. And a majority, 54%, think that the alliance is based on the security interests of both countries, as well as shared values such as democracy and human rights. Among the South Korean public, 3/4 say the US military presence in the Asia-Pacific increases stability in the region, and 83% think the US military presence in the Asia-Pacific should be maintained at its present level or increased. And this figure shows the trend in terms of the US public support to use the US military to defend South Korea. And the American public also remains supportive of US forces in South Korea. 2/3 of Americans say that the United States should maintain long-term military bases in South Korea. And Americans also remain committed to the defense of South Korea, and 53% continues to favor the use of American troops to defend South Korea if North Korea invaded, just 5 percentage points down from 2020. South Korea has so far resisted calls to join the United States in a tougher approach against China, and it's likely to continue this approach. But South Koreans and Americans, at least in the mass public's level, they take strikingly similar views of China. Even with the economic reliance on China, the South Korean public is much more likely to say that China is more of an economic threat than an economic partner, likely due in part to China's past economic coercion against targeting South Korea. And Americans also have a similar view. 67% of them see China more of an economic threat rather than economic partner. And in both countries, roughly 8 in 10 say China is more of a security threat than more of a security partner. But having said that, it's also important to note that China issue was not really the highest priority for either of these countries. In South Korea, the top potential threat included in the survey was low birth rates. 81% of the South Korean public answered that as a critical threat. And in the United States, the top potential threat was political polarization within the country. 65% of the respondents said that that was a critical threat. And in both countries, roughly 6 in 10 view North Korea's nuclear program as a critical threat. And among these survey questions, actually the threat of China was a question that both publics saw as a relatively less critical threat. To continue with positive news for the US-ROK alliance, 2/3 of the South Korean public prefers to strengthen relations with the United States, even if this might diminish relations with China. In the United States, they have a similar view, and among Americans, 74% prefer to build up relations with traditional allies like South Korea and Japan, even if it might diminish relations with China. Well, that's a good piece of information for supporters of the alliance. But when the respondents are given a third choice, that is to build strong relations with allies and to pursue a new partnership with China, so sort of a middle ground, then majority prefer this third option. So they want to pursue both. 72% in South Korea and 63% in the United States prefer this option. So it's not the case that either South Korea or the United States is clearly abandoning cooperation with China. And let me end this lecture by briefly talking about the recent summit between Biden and Moon. Agreements from this summit ranged from engagement with North Korea for denuclearization, terminating the caps on Korean missile program, COVID-19 recovery, and South Korea's investment in semiconductors and emerging technologies and so on, and support US and American support for vaccines in South Korea. So there were a lot of issues. But one obviously really important issue between the two countries was China. And according to media reports, the American side wanted South Korea to take a tough stance, while South Korea tried to avoid provoking China. South Korea's investment on things like semiconductors and electric car batteries are supposed to please the United States, especially because part of that investment is supposed to go to the United States. And by the way, South Korea plans to invest $450 billion by 2030 to become chip powerhouse. And Samsung recently announced, I think, $17 billion investment in the United States. The joint statement avoided naming China specifically, so the joint statement doesn't contain the word China except for the South China Sea. So the statement doesn't specifically name the China as the country, but the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait was included. And this is reportedly a compromise between the United States and South Korea. For President Moon Jae-in, whose term ends in May 2022, making progress with North Korea is utmost importance. And the South Korean government sought cooperation of the Biden administration to accelerate the dialogue between the United States and DPRK, and also to get some flexibility on South Korea's own policy toward North Korea. And by the way, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, relayed his government's concern about the joint statement, but the Chinese reactions have so far been relatively restrained. Let me stop with this, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you for listening.